Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go ahead and dive into the Season 28 Marauder Sentry Demon Hunter build. We're going to be covering the speed variant of this build, which is actually a lot better than I had expected it to be this season. I kind of thought that it would just be entirely outclassed by Gears of the Dreadlands, and it has surprised me a lot. But we're also going to kind of dive into the pushing alternative a little bit and kind of cover your options for your pushing build. For anybody looking to clear a GR 150 this season, this is absolutely a great build to go with. I would say it's definitely an A tier build, probably not on the same level as that LOD Wave of Light Monk or the Taurasha Meteor, but it's definitely the best pushing build for the Demon Hunter. Let's go ahead and start by diving into the skills and passives. Now the generator is a little bit tricky. Depending on if you're pushing or if you're doing speed runs, you may pick something different here. So for the speed run, we're going to be picking Evasive Fire with Hardened. You may notice that the max roll variant recommends that instead you take Focus to gain additional hatred, but we absolutely have no need for that this season. In the Altar of Rites in Season 28, we have the Vigor ability, and based on how many shots this build takes, you are gaining an absurd amount of hatred, and so you do not have to worry about taking that. You would much rather have the Hardened ability on your Evasive Fire to gain additional armor. Now there's two different variations of the pushing build this season, and one of them uses Evasive Fire with Hardened, which would also use a Yang's Recurve. The other one would use Entangling Shot with Odyssey's End. You would also want to make sure that you're going with the Heavy Burden rune. Okay, and our next skill is going to be Cluster Arrow with Maelstrom. If you're pushing, you would rather take Loaded for Bear. Now this does mean that when you're doing a speed version, you're going to want to stack cold damage on your gear. When you're pushing, you're going to want to stack fire damage percent. Now the remainder of our skills are going to be the same for both the pushing and speed version. So we're going to be taking Sentry with Polar Station. Polar Station is very important because it is going to chill the enemies that are in a certain radius of your sentry. This is going to activate your Bane of the Trapped for additional damage. Next up, we're going to take Smokescreen with Special Recipe to reduce the discipline cost. We can effectively spam this all the time without having to worry about running out of discipline, so use this to avoid damage as much as you can because this build is using a Squirt's Necklace, and so we're going to want to keep that buff up as much as possible. If you want to be a little bit greedier, you could go with Vault in this build. However, I generally think in most circumstances, Smokescreen is going to be more helpful. Next up, we're going to take Companion with Wolf Companion. This is going to be part of our burst rotation, so when you are ready to do all of your damage at once, you're going to pop this off. Lastly, we're going to be taking Vengeance with Darkheart, damage reduction, and additional damage. And this also shoots off homing rockets, which for the speed version is very helpful because this is a rocket-based build. Moving into the passives, for the speed version, we're going to be taking Tactical Advantage so that when we Smokescreen, we're going to get a bit of a movement speed increase. And so for the purposes of going through speed GRs, you're pretty much just going to be spamming Smokescreen constantly and just keeping your movement speed up. If you are going with the pushing version, you're probably going to want to take Cold of the Week here instead. Next up for the speed variant is going to be Ballistics so that we are doing more damage from our rockets. Our Maelstrom on the Cluster Arrow, when it hits a target, it fires rockets in all directions, and so this is going to add a bunch of damage. If you're playing the pushing version, you're going to want to take Grenadier instead. Both versions of the build are going to be using custom engineering so that we can have 5 sentries out at a time. And lastly, both versions are also going to be using Ambush because this is a pretty key passive on almost any Demon Hunter build. It just adds too much damage not to take. Now before we move into the gear, the only thing that I want to preface this with is anywhere where we are taking Dexterity, if you're playing the pushing variant, as opposed to Dexterity, you're going to want to be taking area damage. On top of that, anywhere where we are stacking cold damage percent, you're going to want to take fire. But otherwise, the builds are pretty much identical as far as which stats you want to go for. Okay, so moving on to the helm. This is going to be a 5-piece Marauder, 2-piece Captain Crimson with a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube type of build. And so for the helm, you're going to want to take Dexterity, crit hit chance, cluster arrow damage, and a socket with a diamond in it. Moving on to the shoulders, Dexterity or area damage, cooldown, resource cost reduction, and sentry damage. For the Squirt's Necklace, you're going to want to go with cold damage or fire damage percent, crit, and a socket with Zay's Stone of Vengeance. For the gloves, Dexterity or area damage, crit, cooldown. And moving on to the chest, you're going to want Dexterity, Vitality, or Resist All Elements will work just fine, and sentry damage percent, 3 sockets with diamonds in them. For the bracers, you'll want to go with Wraps of Clarity, cold or fire damage percent, dexterity, vitality, and crit hit chance. One note about the Wraps of Clarity is that it is incredibly important to get a really high roll on that secondary stat, so you're going to want to either get it at exactly 50% or as close to it as possible. It is worth taking slightly lower rolls on everything else to take a higher secondary roll on the Wraps of Clarity. And for the belt, we'll be taking Captain Crimson's Dexterity, Vitality, Resist All Elements, and Percent Life. For the rings, we will be using Focus and Restraint. You're going to want to get average damage or cooldown reduction if you're playing the speed variant. Alternatively, if you're pushing, you're going to want area damage. Both builds are going to want to take crit, and a socket. I would also recommend taking the Enforcer gem as well as Bane of the Trapped. And moving on to the focus, this has the same ideal rolls that the restraint does. For the pants, we'll be using Captain Crimson's Dexterity, Vitality, Resist All Elements. 2 sockets with diamonds will do just fine. And for the boots, once again, we're going with Marauders. Dexterity, Vitality, Resist All Elements, and Cluster Arrow damage percent. Now for the offhand, we're going to be taking Bombardier's Rucksack. The first thing that I'll mention about this is the secondary roll. Once again, similar to the Wraps of Clarity, it is very important that you get as high of a secondary roll as possible. And for the rolls for this, you're going to want to go with Dexterity, Attack Speed, Crit Chance, Area Damage, Cooldown, and Sentry Damage, which naturally rolls on it. Although I am playing the speed variation of this build, there isn't really a better alternative to area damage. We really don't need the resource cost reduction. We are getting a ton of resources this season from the Altar of Rites, and so area damage is still fine even though this is the speed variant. And lastly, we're going to want to take Yang's Recurve. We're not concerned with the roll on the secondary. What we are concerned about though is the amount of resource cost reduction that we roll. This can go from 40 to 50%, and so you want to get it as close to 50 as possible. Other than that, 10% damage, dexterity, and cooldown will do just fine. As an alternative to dexterity or cooldown, attack speed also works well. Moving into the cube, we're going to be taking Manticore. This is absolutely essential for the build. There's not really anything else that you can use in this slot. Now for the armor slot, you have quite a few different options. For the speed variation, I like to take Frostburns for the freezing effect and the 20% increased damage. Now as an alternative in the speed variation, you can take St. Archu's Gloves. Each time you damage an elite pack for the first time, you gain an absorb shield equal to 150% of your health. This is really useful because it's going to keep your Squirt's necklace up for longer. And lastly, if you're having survivability issues, you're going to want to take Zoe's Secret. If you're playing the pushing variation, you're absolutely going to want to take Zoe's Secret. I wouldn't consider Frostburns or St. Archu's Gloves in the pushing version. And of course, both builds are going to be taking a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the jewelry slot. Now, most of my builds do not cover Paragon points. However, I felt that it was important to mention something about this build. We're not going to be taking anything in maximum hatred. I do recommend that you try to get up to roughly 800,000 life with this build. We are standing still a lot, which can make you pretty vulnerable, and so it's nice to have a bit of extra health so that you're not going down. But the real thing to take note of here is movement speed. You're only going to need to put 30 points into movement speed for a 15% increase to your movement speed overall. If you'll notice that the 2-piece bonus of our Marauder set says, Companion calls all companions to your side. So we're benefiting from the passive effect of each companion. So because we have all companions at our side, we do have the Ferret Companion, which is going to give us 10% increased movement speed. Unfortunately, this is capped movement speed, meaning that if we go up to 25% on the Paragon points, it is not going to do anything for us. We only want to take those 30 points to go up to 15%. This will get us the additional 10%. And of course, for everything else, you're going to want to go straight into dexterity. If you feel like you're able to survive really well and you're not getting hit very often, feel free to drop the vitality and see how it works out for you. Alright, moving into the follower, I recommend going with the Scoundrel. I will note, I am using the token that gains access to all skills. You're only going to want to use this if you're playing the speed version. If you're doing the pushing variant, you're going to want to take the token that ensures that he cannot die. On top of that, if your Scoundrel is not well geared yet and is not tanky enough, you'll probably just want to go with the token that ensures he stays alive. For the helm, I'm just using a broken crown just so that I can get some additional gems. You can really use whatever you want here. I see a lot of people going with the helm. I believe it's called Blinding Faith. Gives them a pretty decent decent chance to blind on hit when he hits his target. You'll want to stack dexterity and vitality everywhere you can, and I do recommend augmenting all of the gear with intelligence so that he can gain additional all resist. This is going to ensure that he stays alive during these speed runs. Homing pads work just fine for the shoulders. You're especially going to need the Flavor of Time, Nemesis bracers, Oculus ring, and Gloves of Worship. These are the most essential pieces for your follower in Season 28. Other than that, I'm using a Blackthorns here. Tal Rasha's would be slightly better for the attack speed. Now my follower happens to have a Zoe Secret here. It rolled Primal, it has good rolls, so I used it. But if you have a decent Court of the Sherma, you would probably rather use that instead because it has a chance to slow and blind enemies on hit. Other than Oculus Ring, you can pretty much use whatever you want in the other ring slot. I went with an Avarice Band because it's nice for T16. The pants aren't all that important. Whatever you get that rolls best will work just fine. And for the boots, you'll want to take Ice Climbers to gain immunity to freeze and immobilize effects. And for the weapon, whatever works. Dexterity, Vitality, Life per hit, these are good stats, so I went ahead and went with the Cluck Eye, but anything that rolls pretty well is going to be just fine. Now, because I am using this token, I do have access to all skills, but I'm going to go ahead and go over what skills I would recommend if you don't have this token. So on the first row here, there are a lot of people when playing pushing builds that actually don't like to take anything here. They actually ignore it because they don't want these CC effects to go off when they're trying to group up enemies. And so keep that in mind. You may want to leave absolutely nothing here at all. But if you are going to go with something, I like to take Powered Shot personally. Next up, I prefer taking Anatomy. I also prefer Piercing Shot here. And the last one is kind of up to you. Night's Veil is really good if you're not dying. Get that additional damage, but if you find yourself dying a lot, you may want to go with the Vanish. Now, the last thing that I do want to take note of is if you are using the access to all skills tokens, make sure that you level up your Esoteric Alteration as well as your Mutilation Guard for your follower. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive into a few tips and tricks, and the first one that I want to talk about is when you're pushing. With this build, your potion is really important because right off the bat, you're going to want to hit it. I didn't get the right one, you're going to ideally want to hit Empowered. If you can roll Empowered right off the bat, your cooldowns are going to be greatly reduced, and so this is going to get you just about permanent uptime on Vengeance, if not permanent uptime. You're also going to be able to use Companion a lot more for damage, and you're going to be able to get your sentries down so much quicker when you go from level to level. This is also just going to allow you to reposition your sentries really easily, which is kind of the next tip and trick. If you didn't know this about this build, it is really important to put these sentries on top of enemies. You do not want to be stacking these all in the same place. You want to spread them out a bit because you want this little polar area to be covering as many enemies as possible, because this is how we activate our Bane of the Trapped. So another tip is to kind of avoid oversetting your sentries. If you're getting an enemy down that's low on health and you have a sentry that's available, don't drop it on top of that enemy. You're going to want to save it for the next pack. And so if you are taking something out at a good enough speed and you're still regenerating more sentries, don't drop one yet. Go ahead and save it for the next pack. Now, my next tip for this is to really practice Force Move. If you're not comfortable with it or if you don't know what it is, I just did a video on Force Move discussing how you can actually loot gear much quicker in Diablo 3. But Force Move is also really good because we will not shoot anything if we click on it. We can input several movements, and if we click on an enemy or we try to interact with somebody, you notice how it's not working. But if I click on them, it is. And so how this applies to enemies is if I click on an enemy, I'm going to shoot at it. If I'm using Force Move, it will just ensure that I keep going through. I find this to be really important with this build because our movement is not anything like Gears of the Dreadland Demon Hunter where we're just spinning everywhere. With a build like that, we don't need Force Move because we're not really clicking anywhere to move. We're just holding down our click. But for something like this, where we have an evasive fire on our left click, you're really going to want to practice moving around with Force Move. I'll go ahead and put a link down below in the description to my video so that you can check it out. And my last tip for this one, this is pretty straightforward for most people who've been playing Diablo 3 a lot, but maybe if you're on the newer side, make sure that you're stutter stepping around with this build as much as you can. Try to avoid projectiles so that you can keep up the buff on your Squirt's necklace. Well guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here with a little bit of gameplay footage. Go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know how you like the build, if you're enjoying Marauder in Season 28. As always guys, I really appreciate you for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.